when I was preparing this lesson, I was thinking back to when I was growing up. And I remember in the 6th grade, I decided I was going to be an architect. And I began designing houses. In fact, in high school, they allowed me to take architecture as an elective because the teacher there was willing to help me to learn it. And so when, I talked to my parents and they thought, that's great. They wanted me to go to university. And I said, okay. And I started there. And I found out architecture is not exactly what I thought it was going to be. And so I decided to take a year off, and then I was persuaded to consider studying the Bible. And I went there to study. Now, my parents weren't so excited about that alternative, but you know what? They supported me when I was in Bear Valley because they supported the fact that I made a decision for higher education. That was a big priority for my mom. But when you stop and think about, as you were growing up, did your parents have ideas they tried to implant in your mind about what you should do as a career? Yes? Do you want to share, John? They wanted you to be a farmer. Anybody surprised that's been over in 5? Yeah, he said no. Okay, what did they think about that? Disappointed, okay. Someone else? Still disappointed. There's still a farm there. Anyone else want to share if there was a strategy you had that your parents didn't have?
Well, it's not so much a strategy, but they wanted me to, I went to be a military lifer, that sort of thing. So that's, they encouraged me in that too.
Okay.
Because I did real well on the tests, when you sign when you go down and do, well, I forget what they called it. Back when you were 18, you're supposed to sign up for selective service. That's what it was.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That came to my mind as I was looking in Mark chapter 10. Last week, Gene taught in his lesson that this would be the 3rd time that Jesus explains to his disciples or predicts his coming death in Jerusalem. In fact, he mentioned that chapter 8 is one of those turning points in the book where Jesus begins moving his disciples' minds towards Jerusalem and toward what they could expect there. It is not what they expected. And as we were looking through in previous lessons, I said his strategy was he would teach them, he would show them, and then he would what? Test them. He would test them to see if they learned. And so when they didn't pass the test, guess what? They started again, and he would teach them and show them. So he's already taught them 2 times that he's going to Jerusalem and die. Do you remember their reaction? It was almost Peter who said, God forbid, remember, you answered that the last time, that should happen to you. And what did Jesus say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan, because it was God's purpose and his purpose for coming here that's what would happen. But the disciples did not understand the idea about Jesus as the Messiah, as the King, as the coming kingdom that John the Baptist predicted. So when we come to chapter 10, you will find, as we looked at last week, Jesus has another teaching for them on this subject. Let's read that because it connects very closely with what we'll be looking at in verse 34. But let's look at Mark chapter 10, 32 through 34. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. And again he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, Behold, we are going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise again. Jesus adds one new thing to this text that he didn't say in the previous 2. Did you catch what it was? He's going to be raised on the 3rd day, but he predicted that 3 times. Yeah, that's what should have given them hope. But you remember one time they didn't know what he was saying and they were afraid to ask him. And so the main difference is they said he will be handed over to the Gentiles. Who's that? The Romans. And what would the Romans do? It says in verse 34, they would mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him. Okay? So he gives them more details, not more encouraging from their point of view, but this is something that they needed to understand in order to be prepared for the future that's coming their way. Even though there is more difficulty in what he predicts the Gentiles will do, there is the consistent theme, the consistent teaching that he will be resurrected, but they didn't understand this, and they didn't see how it fit into who they thought the Messiah was going to be and what his kingdom would be like. But in this text, you remember that James and John's mother has some expectations for them. From reading the text, I'm not quite sure that she was the only one that originated this. I'm suspicious that the two, James and John put her up to it. But in Matthew chapter 10, 35 through 40, there's a request made of Jesus that sounds a little bit like Peter. You know, Peter was always the one who was impulsive, a little bit rash, and he was always jumping into the conversation and saying something that would get him into trouble. But here, James and John stand out. Let's look at this in verse 35. James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." So, of all the things that we see in this passage, what to you is the most shocking? What shocks you about what goes on in this conversation? Paul?
Well, one thing I see here is the fact that they don't realize that they're going to be serving him and doing things that are going to be a little bit dangerous themselves, you know.
Okay.
So I think maybe the point is that they're still running around a little bit, not understanding everything, maybe. You know?
Yes, there's some fog here. They're definitely not understanding what it means. Bill?
On top of what brother was saying, Jesus just told them that he was going to be beat up and spit and scourged and mocked and then killed.
Yeah.
And they have no questions about, what do you mean? Should we go somewhere else? Last week we were just talking about what were they amazed about as they were on the road. They were amazed that Jesus was going back to Jerusalem where he had already been threatened and all that. So you would have thought there would have been a follow-up conversation after Jesus' comments.
Yeah, it seems a bit crass, doesn't it? They don't even have a moment, not even a second, to say, "Oh, we're so sorry," or anything. It's just right away, boom, okay? And what is it that they want? Make us more important than anybody else. They want on the left and the right. There's only one place in Mark's gospel that talks about people being on the left and the right of Jesus. Do you remember who those people were? Goats and sheep, but I'm talking people. On the cross, that's right. The two thieves were on his left and his right. And they seem to have a clearer understanding, at least one of them did, of who Jesus was. But the idea here, if you go back to Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, Matthew includes some things, obviously, that Mark doesn't. That Matthew's much bigger. But there in Matthew 20, verse 20, it says, "Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, 'What do you wish?' And she said to him, 'Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit one on your right and one on your left.'" So we've mentioned this before. It appears that the idea is whose idea? Their mom. This is Salome, right? They think this, the problem with that is Jesus doesn't answer her. Who does he answer? The sons. She asks the question, he immediately turns to the sons, because she probably didn't surprise the sons with this question of Jesus. But this is something we know in Matthew's gospel. He responds to her sons, and it's probably a little bit shocking to them. But the earlier dispute that the two brothers had, I don't know that it's just the two brothers, but in Mark chapter 9, verse 34, as they're walking along, the disciples are farther behind, and Jesus stops and says to them, "What have you been talking about?" Do you remember what they'd been talking about? Who's the greatest in the kingdom? So I don't think this idea was just Salome's idea. I think they put their mother up to it. In some cultures, that's really the way it is. I remember in Slovakia, when you were going to ask a favor of somebody, you would ask their mother, because they obviously have influence on their children. But in this particular case, the dispute was stopped, but it wasn't buried. They were stopped from talking about it. David Garland, in his commentary, writes, "These two act like brazen fortune hunters when they ask Jesus to guarantee that one can sit on his right and the other on his left when he comes in glory." He says, this is crass behavior, and they don't even know it. He went on and say, "But James and John appear to want more than that. They appear to want to be crown princes, sitting on co-thrones with Jesus." Well, it appears that way. It may not be what was in their mind, but the point is they've not moved very far from the previous teaching and the previous rebuke of Peter. These two apparently were not so far behind what Peter was thinking. They misinterpret what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah, and they make the assumption that when he brings in his kingdom, who's going to get all the benefits? His close friends and colleagues, right? That's the 12. And if 12 are fighting for 2 chairs, what's the motivation? Who gets there first? Yeah, to be the two. And so they're not going to waste any time. They're going to bring it up as soon as they can. But Jesus is trying to teach them something entirely different by his example. What is he trying to teach them? What's come up over and over again? Pardon me? Humility. Humility is necessary, yes?
Well, I was going to say humility, but also the fact that they were going to be serving him, like I said earlier.
Yes.
They're going to be servants, not at the high points of, being next to him.
This is exactly it. The two of these are together. They needed to humbly recognize that the position that Jesus had set for them was to be a servant. And their example is Jesus. He's the example. They are not getting the message, and they're getting close because they're on their way now to Jerusalem. So the teaching that Jesus has had 3 times on his death, burial, and resurrection, they have failed to get 3 times. John?
I just thinking, like, reading this, and the patience and the love of Christ, like, overflows, because here he is, like, getting ready to be on his deathbed and to be crucified, and he's teaching these guys, and teaching these guys, and then he's like, "I'm gonna die," and they're like, "Well, what are you gonna do for me?"
Yeah, exactly.
I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they asked that. Like, he just
Yeah.
went through telling him he's gonna die and be scourged, and then they're like, "Teacher, what are you gonna do for us, whatever we ask?" And
Yeah.
Jesus is like, "What would you like?" And you're like, I can't believe they asked that question.
Well, and the interesting thing, the way that John mentions this, the interesting thing about their question is they ask it in what way? "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Who asks that kind of question in our culture? A child. "Can I have what I want for lunch, Mom?" No, they didn't say, "Could I have a specific thing?" They just say, "Agree that we can have whatever we ask." All right. Yes. Yes, his answer is very gracious, isn't it? He could have blasted them, and probably some of us might have done that, but he was very gracious to them in his response. He says, after that, continuing his grace, you don't know what? You don't know what you're asking. Because to sit on his left and his right means what in the kingdom of Jesus? If the king in the center is going to be crucified and suffered, what are those two on his sides going to do? Same thing. And so he brings it up here, as we can see in the text. The occasion is probably the most explicit demonstration of how the disciples have misunderstood everything that Jesus has taught about the Messiah and what their role is going to be in the kingdom. And it's also Jesus's most explicit teaching, because he has to get down to the bare facts. They're not getting it any other way. So he uses two metaphors to help them understand what it means to be on his left and his right, because he asked them, are you able? Are you able to do this? Are you able to take what it will require to be in those seats? And what is their answer? Yeah, sure, we can do it. We're all ready. But he uses two metaphors here. He says, drink the cup. Can you drink the cup? What does that metaphor mean?
Well, it reminds me of his prayer in the garden.
Uh-huh.
If there's any other way, let this cup pass from me.
Yes, it's that very idea. So the cup represented what? The suffering, okay? And to drink the cup is to accept the suffering and experience it. So it's a metaphor of suffering. It comes from Isaiah 51, verse 17. And Jesus will use it, as Tommy said, in the Garden of Gethsemane. But then he uses another phrase. He talks about being baptized. What does that have to do with their suffering? Pardon me? They're going to be buried. That word baptism has many different uses. It can be buried, overwhelmed, completely immersed. So depending on the context, it's translated in different ways. But in this situation, wow, they're going to have it poured onto them, and they don't even know. But they're willing. They're willing. Okay, yeah, I can drink the cup. I can be baptized. Jesus didn't get sprinkled with suffering. He didn't get suffering poured on him. As you were saying, he was buried in suffering, all right? And so he's pointing out to them, all right, if you're on the left and the right, this is what you're going to have to do. This is not probably what the two disciples expected. But what happened to the two of them? Do you remember? James is what? He's the first martyr, if you remember. And Acts chapter 12, 1 through 2. He's of the apostles, I mean. He's not necessarily the first martyr. But John also suffered. What happened to John? He was exiled and imprisoned to the end of his life on the island of Patmos. You can read about that. But there is a sense in which they got to sit on thrones. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, Jesus said they would sit on the thrones judging the 12 tribes, okay? Not what they expected, because even in that, they're not being glorified. They're what? They're serving. Even in that, they're serving. And so their minds are so far away from what is the reality that Jesus is facing. I think I might have been in a little bit of a panic when we're nearly on the footsteps of Jerusalem and they haven't gotten it yet. Why is it valuable that they know in advance that his crucifixion was not a mistake? Why is that valuable to know in advance?
So they don't give up.
So they don't give up. That's the key. They're prepared. If we know something's going to be difficult and we're prepared for it, it's not as likely to overwhelm us, and they needed to be prepared. Plus, they don't understand why he came. They're still thinking the great kingdom and establishing an empire is why he came. But he came for what reason? To seek and save that which was lost. And that required what? He had to sacrifice himself. There was no other way that we could be saved apart from that. And we know that there's no other way because, as some of you have mentioned, in the garden, he asked if there was another way. And the answer from God was what? No. There's no other way. And so here we have the example of Jesus. He's showing them. Did you have another comment?
It's also interesting that they didn't come back to after Jesus having told them 3 times that he's going to rise again. What exactly does that mean, you're going to rise again?
Right. Yeah, you would have thought that the most optimistic part of that, which they didn't understand, they would ask for an explanation on. But by now, perhaps they're used to the fact that they get so many answers wrong, they're afraid to ask questions. What does Jesus teach about positions of authority or honor in his kingdom? By how he's relating to them. What is he teaching about positions of authority or honor? That's what way? It's not the kingdom way. It's what way? The world way. It's the way of the world, all right? And their mind is in the opposite direction of where it needs to go. The positions that they're asking for, Jesus doesn't even have the authority to give, because that's reserved for whom to give? God the Father, yeah. This is not something that he can give, but God has chosen what will happen there. The next verses, Jesus makes some additional emphasis to get them in the right direction. We've had the teaching again of what is going to happen to Jesus. There's no alternative. They're not having the kind of kingdom that they expect. It's not going to be the way they have imagined it. And so Jesus goes on in Mark chapter 10, verse 35, and he brings up some information we've already seen about the 2 sons of Zebedee and their willingness to sit on his left and right if it's a position of glory and honor, but it is not. And they're going to have to find out that something else is in store for them. So in the verses that we see that Jesus has taught already, the position of glory always comes after suffering. And the glory is given by God. It's not demanded by us. And so the question and their understanding show that they have failed to understand. Instead of serving, they want to do what? They want to rule. They want to be those who dominate. And so Jesus, by his answer to them, shows that they don't know. Not only do they not know what they're asking, they don't know what their position is and why it's a different thing than they've been considering. In the next section, Jesus goes to another teaching. In verses 41 through 45. They've failed the test on the previous teaching. So he goes on. Look at verse 41 through 45. Whoever wishes to become great shall be your servant is the theme. Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John, calling them to himself. Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So, if you're the 10, and you've listened to Mama and the 2 make their dramatic request, how would you feel about that? I wish I'd have thought of that. I'm wondering if, because it says here that they're what? Verse 41. It says they're indignant, which suggests what? There sounds like jealousy, some jealousy there. Some anger. There's something going on there. But I wonder if it's not entirely righteous anger, but a little bit of jealousy because they hadn't thought of it. And so there's now turmoil in the ranks, probably. They'd already been discussing who was the greatest, and probably Peter, James, and John were arguing for their own position as being at the top. But now that they had the the nerve to ask such a favor, they've stirred up the turmoil within the 12. Now, why is that a problem?
One thing I was thinking there is it also shows, we give Peter a hard time about just blurting out what he thinks in front of
Yeah.
everybody. That James and John didn't have the tact to pull Jesus aside and ask him this question. But they just asked right out in front of the whole group.
Oh, yes. At least Peter would take him aside. Now they've asked in front of the whole group, and the whole group's in a turmoil, and there's jealousy going on here. Now, who does this serve? Satan. Jesus could have turned to all 12 of them and said, "Get behind me, Satan," because Jesus is concerned that these people be prepared to take over the ministry that he's going to give them, in which they have already been practicing in at his death. And so they've done the opposite. Rather than give him encouragement in his last few days here on earth, they've given him reason to be more concerned. The 12, as a whole, have failed to understand. And so Jesus teaches them in verses 42 through 44 the same lesson one more time. He says, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant." He's emphasized the idea one more time. In verse 45, it begins with the word "for." So if we go down at verse 44, "And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all." For. What does "for" usually mean in a sentence? Yes, because. Look at what has gone before for an explanation of the connection to this verse. The reason for verse 45, he says, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. This service of Jesus is the model, is the example for the service of the disciples, and they're not getting that either. All that Jesus did the years that they traveled with him is help people, even at the risk of his own safety because of the leaders of Israel. So he points them to their own purpose in the kingdom. The model and reason for their servanthood is Jesus himself. They're not going to learn this from the world. Why not?
Well, one of the things that I think about is what our service should be,
Yes.
being servants. And, one of the things that really sticks in my heart a lot is the fact of sowing the seed of the kingdom.
Yes.
And that can get you in trouble. It did others.
Yes.
And especially the Roman Christians and so forth.
Yes.
They were given to lions, all this kind of stuff, the things they had to go through, the
Yes.
persecution, and the torture, and et cetera. We've got to be, in our mind, able to deal with that, to be able to say, I'm willing to die for doing that.
So the servanthood comes upon
To
all
serve.
of those who
All of
follow.
us, all of us.
All those who follow Jesus have this principle that they need to learn. In verse 45, we have at the end, he didn't come to serve, but to do what? He didn't come to be served, but to serve. Right. For what purpose? He would be what? He'd give his life a ransom for many. All right. So he didn't come to be served, but to serve. The word ransom means what? Your translation may have a different word, I don't know. The New American Standard has ransom. What is ransom? It's a payment. What kind of payment? Why do you pay a ransom? He paid the debt for our sins. We owed a debt. And he paid that debt. Here it's called a ransom. We know of it perhaps in the sense of going to a pawn shop and giving them something, and you give us some money, and you have a certain period of time. If you bring them back the money, you get your object back. But of course, you've had to pay them some fee for that privilege. But also when someone's kidnapped and you want someone safely returned, you have to pay a ransom. So you're paying for them to be returned. Here the ransom has to do with our soul. We are held captive by our sin, as Jolene is pointing out, and we are helpless to solve the problem ourselves. We have no alternative. So we turn to Jesus, who paid the ransom for our sin with his blood. This word ransom is used in the sense of compensation for personal injury, for a crime, for purchasing the freedom of an enslaved relative. That's how it's used in the Jewish culture and how it would be used here. It means literally to loose, to set loose, okay? And that's to set loose or set free from whatever obligation that you might have had. In this particular case, he's talking about being set free from sins. And so he's pointing them to the real purpose for his coming. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Wouldn't you have been tempted to say, what does it mean, life as a ransom for many? There are so many things there that we look at and say, why not ask? Why didn't they ask? They were sure that they knew. And yet at every turn, what happened? They were wrong at every turn. And so sometimes the challenge that we have is life tests us. And our worldview, our perspective may fail us, in which case we need to stop and figure out what's going on here. So metaphorically, Jesus is telling them that he would suffer on behalf of others. He would pay the price for their sins. And the disciples are going to need to understand that, because most of them will die in their service. Some of them in a very unpleasant way. So Mark has emphasized in this teaching that the death of Jesus is the model for sacrificial service. And as Paul was saying, that's the model even today. So there shouldn't be in God's kingdom today competition for power or position or places. No, there shouldn't. Is there? From time to time, try buying new carpet and deciding what the color is going to be. It seems absurd, but sometimes we can forget how that is in comparison to the sacrificial service of Jesus and what he did in order to provide what we need. Now, the testing and the teaching situations have not turned out, to their recommendation. They've been failing quite a bit here. And so there's another testing and teaching situation that comes up in verse 46 through 52. This is a beggar named Bartimaeus, who's blind, okay? And why is this blind person a beggar? Because he's blind. But blind people today aren't beggars. What's the difference? In their culture, they didn't have the alternatives that we have. Now, by Jewish law, who was supposed to take care of this person? The family. And beyond the family, it was the responsibility of the community. But sometimes it failed. Okay, and so it says then they came to Jericho. Remember, they're coming down from Galilee, going along the valley there, the Jordan River Valley, and they come to Jericho, which is down there in that valley. And it says, and he was leaving Jericho with his disciples, and a crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus was there, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. And when he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him here. And so they called the blind man, saying to him, take courage, stand up, he's calling for you. And throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering him, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabboni, I want to regain my sight. And Jesus said to him, go, your faith has made you well. Immediately he regained his sight, and he began following him on the road. So here's Jesus, He's been trying over and over again to teach his disciples. They fail, they fail, they fail. And he's on his way to the city where he's going to die, and he's not far away. And he gets interrupted by what person? A blind beggar. Nobody has any respect for him. And what does Jesus do? In spite of all his difficulties and trials and challenges, he stops and he asks him a question. What does he want to know? What do you want me to do for you? Why would that be an important question? Why did beggars stand on that road before the great celebrations? To get money. By definition, they are beggars. Where are people traveling? By the thousands. And they want to look good when they get where they're going. So guess what? They might give you a few coins. So he probably wasn't the only one there. There are probably several. In fact, the other Gospels suggest there are at least two. We don't have it in Mark because, Mark just compresses it down. All we needed to know was about Bartimaeus. So Bartimaeus, when he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, what does he immediately say in response? He says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And what he's asking for in asking for mercy is what? Healing. This is the idea that he's looking to be healed. And what were the people around him saying? Be quiet, shush. Why? Because he's nobody compared to Jesus. Jesus is famous. He's done famous things. Yes, Gene.
So we get the idea from John chapter 9, they looked on blind people as having sin. That's the reason they're blind.
Yes.
And so this is a sinner. Yes. So why would I want to pay attention? Why would he be worth anything? He's a sinner.
Yes, exactly. And this has happened in other situations. When Jesus was in Capernaum, the person was brought there and he forgives him his sin when he'd come there to be healed. You remember, drop down? This is an important idea to remember. In their culture, he was in that low position because obviously his sins had led to that blind way that he was living. Now, you remember when Job was suffering so many things, what were his kind friends telling him? Suck it up. Yeah, you're a sinner. You're just getting what you deserve. And poor old Job is saying, I didn't do anything wrong. And they're saying, liar. But we know, because we saw the meeting in heaven, didn't we? We know that what he was saying to them was true. But the culture gets the idea sometimes that these consequences have to be the result of sin, and especially the situation of blindness. Some disciples asked Jesus, was this person the sinner or were his parents the sinner? It was such a common idea there that this is an unimportant person in their culture. He's asking Jesus for something, interrupting him when he's on his way to the great celebration in Jerusalem, and they just want him to be quiet. And so we find him here not giving up, unwilling to be silent. Okay, Bill?
I was going to say, it's interesting how this blind Bartimaeus didn't know Jesus, knew of Jesus, but yet he gave him the description of the Son of David. Where did that come from?
This is actually the question I was thinking about coming to next. Is he calls him Son of David? Have mercy on me. Where did he get that idea? What does that suggest to you about him?
Well, didn't they all know that the Messiah was going, or the Christ was going to be Son of David?
They did.
Yeah, that was
Exactly.
taught, yeah.
So what you're seeing here is this blind man, this person who can't see, who is a beggar, has figured out some things that the 12 disciples who can see and have been with Jesus have not figured out yet. He's suggesting something about him.
Well, it also tells you maybe something of how widely word about Jesus had spread. That
Yes.
even the people that society would look at as of no importance at all, they know exactly who he is.
Yes. And if you're talking about the people from Galilee, they had quite a bit of experience so far, and they had an idea of who he was saying he was and the things that he had done to support it. When you get close to Jerusalem, they're influenced by whom? Those people. They're influenced by the leaders of Israel. What's their view of Jesus? He's troublemaker. He's bad. They're going to get rid of him. Okay, they've already plotted that. Was it John chapter 11, where they said we're going to have to kill him? They're also going to kill who else? Lazarus, because he raised him from the dead. Interesting. They acknowledge that he could raise him from the dead, but they're going to kill him anyway. So this is the challenge for Jesus. He has amongst his own disciples people who are able to see, and yet it's the blind man who sheds light on who Jesus is. And naturally, if he's standing there and there are thousands going up the hill from Jericho to Bethphage and then down into Jerusalem, people are talking about him. Some of the things they were saying would be what? Do you think he's going to show up? All of them wanted to see him, so they were asking that. Anyway, he asks to see, by calling him Son of David, have mercy on him. And so he has an understanding a little bit about who Jesus is, although we don't have the details of how he learned that. So he threw aside his cloak in verse 50, and he jumped up and came to Jesus. Why did Jesus ask him what he wanted him to do? Why ask him that? Yes, so everybody else could hear. And typically, people along that road were asking for what? Money, okay? And he's got a priority that's different. He's asking a person for his sight. Who can give sight to blind people? Only God. And so you're beginning to see here that this blind person knows a lot more than the disciples do. And so it's a teaching moment. Yes?
Well, I find it funny that he asks James and John that exact same question. What do you want me to do for you?
Yes.
And they said, well, we want a promotion. And now he asked Bartimaeus, what do you want me to do for you? And he said, I just want to see.
Here we have the contrast. It's not only taught by Jesus, here's the visual aid. Here's the way they should be acting, the attitude. And so his own disciples are still fighting over power and glory and who's going to be the greatest. And all this guy wants is, can I have my eyesight? And so you see a totally different view. Back to what you were saying, humility is here. He's not demanding. He didn't say, I want, as if I deserve, but he asked for mercy. He asked God, or Jesus, for mercy. So the passage here shows on this route to Jerusalem that Jesus, even in the difficult, challenging times, takes the moment to stop and speak to Bartimaeus. Now, Bartimaeus eventually did what? What does it say there? He followed him. He had his sight. He didn't run off, go do whatever he hadn't been able to do all those years because he was blind. He follows Jesus, all right? So this is a visual aid, not only to the disciples then, but also to us. In response to Bartimaeus being healed, it says in Luke chapter 18, verse 43, immediately he regained his sight and began following him, glorifying God. And when all the people saw it, they gave praise to God. So we see here the opportunity that Jesus takes to help this man that brings opportunity for faith among those who are watching. And it shows the principle that Jesus is trying to teach to his disciples. He shows him what's internal in Jesus. Jesus shows him compassion. Here's a person who's suffering. Jesus takes away his suffering and shows compassion. His disciples need to learn that. Okay, so the testing and the teaching and the testing and the teaching. Someone passes the test. It's Bartimaeus, the formerly blind man. Isn't it interesting they would say the blind man Bartimaeus, even though he's not blind anymore? Formerly blind man, we would probably say. So what do we learn about leadership from Jesus? Instead of seeking more power and greater celebrity, let us follow Christ's lead and seek greater opportunities to serve. This is the example he's showing. Human nature gets in the way, and we have to be careful. Suffering distinguishes Jesus' role as Messiah, and it should distinguish our role as disciples. If we know and understand Jesus, and we see that he accepted his destiny as a Messiah to die for others, then we need to accept our destiny in serving others as well. All followers must share his self-giving love and service and his fate of suffering before we can experience glory. Shall we close in a word of prayer? Father, we are thankful for this opportunity to look at the disciples and to see their learning process, and Father, to know that Jesus did not give up on them, though they failed over and over again. And especially, Father, we get to see from Bartimaeus the kind of faith and trust and willingness that he had in order to call upon your Son Jesus for mercy, and then to follow him as a result of the mercy he received. Thank you for these lessons that we are seeing, because we know, Father, we are challenged as well. We know that being baptized doesn't take away jealousy. It doesn't take away the challenges of worldliness in our thinking, that we have to surrender that and allow your Spirit and your word to work in us, that we might change for the better. So we pray for your work in our lives, that we might renew our minds and be those people who can suffer sacrificially in order for the growth of the kingdom. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.